This is Unforgettable Learning, where we talk to L&D visionaries, experts, and mavericks about performance, creativity, and tech. Subscribe to stay in touch. Hey JD, how you doing?
I'm all right, Kate. How's it going?
And I'm so glad that you could join us. I've been really looking forward to our chat, and we're going to hopefully touch a bit on the book that I know was released in 2022. And yeah, well done. Good marketing. Yeah, we'll delve into that. I'd really enjoy delving into that and talking a bit about the kind of career that you've had. I would love to just start with the roots of your career in Disney and how that shaped the way you think now and your passions around frontline training. So could you tell us a bit about your sort of early career to get us warmed up?
I started out as a movie theater manager. So that was my very first job. I managed AMC theaters in mostly Central Florida. And when you work in movie theaters, you have an odd schedule because you're really busy at night. So I was typically going into work at 5 p.m., leaving at 2 a.m., 4 to 5 days a week. And when you're off from work, everyone else is working. And when your weekends are Tuesdays and Wednesdays and things like that. So I needed something to do.
What do you mean you needed something to do? You needed a break, no? That's the whole point.
Yeah, but I was in college and in high school. I did a lot of extracurricular activities. So I was
you're a high achiever
who I don't do well with downtime. I needed something to do. And I also was interested, I was a manager for several years, and I was interested in doing something where I didn't have to make decisions and I didn't have to carry the keys and people weren't looking to me, just something casual and fun. And I knew people who worked at Disney. So I got a part-time job at Disney and I was an attractions host. So anyone who's a Star Wars fan, I worked at Star Tours, the simulator ride at Disney's Hollywood Studios, then Disney MGM Studios.
So cool.
Yeah, I wore very bright blue pants and very bright orange shirt. And I sent people to the Forest Moon of Endor every 12 minutes. And
wow,
I very
every 12
quickly,
minutes.
It's a lot of, it's a very effective travel agency at Star Tours. But I figured out quickly, I really enjoyed what I was doing. And more than that, I enjoyed what we were doing and what the company stood for. I've been a lifelong Disney fan and I was fully bought in very quickly. So after about 6 months of being a part-time cast member, started scheming to say, well, how do I make the transition? How do I work here all of the time instead of what I was doing, which was working 5 days at one job and 3 to 4 days at another job? Anyone out there doing the math knows there aren't 9 days. So I worked a lot for a period of time, but I had to prove myself to a new organization. So I started cross-training in every capacity I could. I became a coordinator at different operations. I became a trainer. I picked up every designation so that when it came time to look at people for new management positions, I, on paper, was a great choice. And then I, of course, had several years of experience managing busy operations of a different kind, but there's a lot of similarities there. And then I was lucky and earned my spot to become an operations manager at Disney. Spent a couple of years doing that, and then was kind of in the right time, in the right place with the right skill set to go into learning and development. So I started my L&D career formally with Disney. I had done HR related work before. When you're the operational HR person, you kind of absorb the training responsibilities and onboarding responsibilities and things like that. So I'd done that type of stuff informally in the past. But my first formal L&D gig was as a facilitator at Disney.
Now, wait, let me stop you there. Did you have to give up the blue pants? Or could you still wear your costume as the L&D facilitator?
So that's a good point. So I managed to get past the blue pants. On that
slightly
journey.
Crushed to hear that.
But both from it, I never stopped having fun in the costume.
Good.
I always enjoyed the different types of operations I worked in, whether I was management or a frontline cast member. And at the end of the story with Disney, I go back to being a frontline cast member because I left the company, but I didn't leave the company. So I went and took my L&D career to another opportunity, but I stayed on at Disney at the end of the story as a Jungle Cruise skipper. So I was a skipper at the world famous Jungle Cruise for a while, again, on the weekends. So I've driven the same 10-minute route over and over and over again. And I have a ridiculous catalog of Disney related jokes in the back of my head. So if this conversation goes sideways, we can go straight there. But I like the point about the pants, just because during my time at Disney, I never stopped putting the costume on because I thought, especially when I went to learning and development, it was critical for me to not lose touch with what it's like to do the job every day, what it's like to work directly with guests, what it's like to deal with the pressure that you face. And also, in addition to keeping me aware of what the experience is like, despite the fact that I'd done it for a little while, it also helped me build trust with the people I was trying to help. So when they saw me be willing to do the same job that they were doing and be really good at it, there was a certain level of trust when I was their manager, or if I was the L&D person facilitating a program with them. So I never stopped putting the costume on. It's one of the things I recommend anybody out there is that, especially if you've never done the work that you're supporting, or it's been a while since you've done it, put the costume back on a regular basis, because it helps reestablish that connection, and it makes you that much more practical and contextual when you come forth with recommendations and solutions.
Yeah, excellent. I know that there are a lot of clients we work with. Tesco springs to mind, actually, that each, at least once a year, the kind of people who are based in office and management go into the store, and exactly as you say, you're in touch with the real work. Not that it isn't real work in the office, but you're in touch with the frontline work. You're in touch with the customers. You're seeing how the pace of things. You're getting that whole kind of recap on the flavour of interactions with your colleagues, with customers, with break times. I think absolutely. Just feels really important. And is this where your kind of passion for, perhaps, and I know we've talked a little bit before about this niche that you have around frontline workers, and is that your passion, and is this where it began, do you think?
I'd say it started from the very beginning, because if you were to ask me what was the best training experience I've ever had, it's the first time I got onboarded into my very first job. Because when I started at that first movie theater outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, I was scared, because I was scared to talk to people. I had never interacted with the public.
I can't believe that. I find that you were scared. You were scared.
Until I went to college, I was one of those people who would say, I'd rather have anything else happen to me than to get up in front of people.
Really?
Yeah. So I was that person at the time. I'd never worked with the public. I went to a very small high school where I graduated with 94 people. And then I went and I worked at what at the time was one of the 5 or 10 busiest movie theaters in the country. I never handled money. We weren't exactly doing a lot with credit at that point. There were no mobile app payments. So I was just scared. I don't know why I was doing this. I like movies, was really, and on something on the weekend or something during the summer to do between high school and college. And the first onboarding experience I had, I remember my trainer's name was Tommy. And he not only was patient and not only kind of personalized the experience, but that experience of training had so much practice in it. I remember us cordoning off a part of a concession stand that no one was using and going through drills over and over and over again about how to fulfill an order, how to take a payment, how to count back change. So by the time I did it for real, I was still nervous, but I had built some of that muscle memory and some of that knowledge that I could do. And again, selling popcorn at a concession stand is not the most complicated job in the world. But for someone I was less scared about the kind of tactical parts of selling products and more about just facing the public. So that's where things began for me in terms of thinking about the importance of enabling frontline employees, the experience people have, and that kind of wide range of people who work in this part of the workforce. There's me, 17-year-old kid doing his first job, working alongside someone who's 45 years old, and this is what they're doing for a living, right? So that kind of sensibility starts there. And then I think it fuses to my identity at Disney, because I was a frontline cast member. I was a manager of frontline cast members, and I became learning and development that supported all of the audience at Walt Disney World. But the numbers skew towards the frontline cast. So spent a ton of time in classrooms and in the operational frontline cast members. And then even after that, I go and I support contact center operations in my next gig. So my entire career has been wrapped around enabling the frontline workforce, and that's built a reverence for and a respect for and an empathy for the type of work that these folks do every day. So when I say they do the heavy lifting for our organizations, I'm not really kidding. Like you said it, every job is hard, right? Every job comes with its complexities. But when people say things about, I get irked when people talk about like low skill jobs. And I just want to say, okay, if you think being a server in a restaurant's a low skill job, you go serve tables for 10 hours and tell me how easy that is, or how little skill or how little knowledge. Knowledge worker is another one that gets to me. So I think, making sure we not only have reverence for and appreciation for that work, but we also do what we can to give them the best chance to do their best work every day and the tools and resources, given that I know it's a hard math problem because regardless of the size of your organization, I've worked with big and small organizations that employ a large number of frontline workers. And even if you have 400,000 frontline workers and you have an L&D team that's got 400 people in it, or you support 1,000 people and you have an L&D team with 3 people in it. It's a hard math problem to figure out with my resources, how do I provide the right support for that many people? But the good news is I think we're getting better and better at it, and there's more and more opportunity to do a good job as long as we prioritize and focus on enabling these folks.
Well, I love that you mentioned that. And I was just thinking, can you kind of describe how many of tell me a bit more about the profile of frontline workers. So you've mentioned a few there, but are we talking about just sort of retail and customer service? How much of the workforce are we talking about? And how do you sort of define this today in your work?
The estimate generally puts it around 70 to 80% of the global workforce constitutes the frontline workforce.
So more than the majority.
Well, more. And I generally describe it because it's hard to profile with a specific type of work, but the people who work directly with your products and customers every day as the core part of their job. Some people define it as the people who physically report to a location to do the jobs, right? Some people use terms like deskless workforce, but the generalized example I use are people like people in the retail stores, in the grocery stores, manufacturing facilities, delivery drivers. I would consider first responders and emergency services personnel, agricultural workers. So the people who are on the literal front lines of your business, who are kind of the for lack of a better term, tip of the spear when it comes to execution, who are bringing the brand to life, delivering the products and services to customers. That's the contingent of the workforce that I've spent most of my time thinking about and working with and being part of for the last 20 years. And I think it's also the most underserved population, given the fact that I don't think a lot of organizations are necessarily sitting out there saying, we shall not provide effective support for our frontline workers. I think it has just traditionally been a difficult math problem to figure out how within the constraints and within the time and budget availability, how do we get people the support that they need? But I think more now than ever, we have the chance to, but it's that 70 to 80% of the world works in these types of roles. And we, as consumers, even if you don't work in a frontline role, you encounter frontline workers every day just going about your life because they're the ones who are making a lot of those processes work.
And tell me more about this dilemma that's facing the frontline workers and their managers. And you mentioned the word underserved, and I think we've even explored a little bit these people maybe getting burnout, particularly at the management level. What's the problem here?
So when you talk specifically about managers, around half of frontline managers are burnt out on a daily basis right now. And it was always hard to do that job. And I can just speak from experience. It is a difficult position because you're often, I refer to frontline management or middle management as kind of the middle seat of the modern workforce. When you think about an airplane, right? You're kind of crammed in the middle and you don't have elbow room, but both sides are kind of annoying to your existence while you're on the plane. Because on one side, you have the corporate team who has priorities and demands and expectations and assigning you more and more work. And on the other side, you have your frontline team who looks to you for pretty much everything. I often say frontline workers don't work for your company. They work for their managers because they don't see the corporate team. They might get messages from the corporate team and the CEO, but who makes my schedule, right? Who makes sure I get paid? Who tells me I'm doing a good job and coaches me when I'm not? It's that person or that team of people, depending on the size of your operation. So I made a set of predictions for this year, things that partially I believe will happen, but partially that I would like to happen, or I think should happen based on the prevailing winds of change in the workplace. And one of those recommendations or predictions was that I think this year has to become a year of the managers because the last couple of years have made the job go from difficult to intolerable because of what we've been asking managers to do. There's the pandemic side of the story, which is we asked managers to become counselors just as much as they were trying to run their business. And then as budget changes happened, we started to tighten resources because of economic uncertainty and those types of factors. We just keep asking managers to get more done with less staff and less labor hours. And they're working 70, 80 hours a week to make up the gap. And they're still being looked at by their teams as the go-to for everything. So how can we make that job more tolerable, more capable? Because we know that as the manager goes, so goes the frontline team. A great frontline manager can make an okay job a great experience. A bad frontline manager can make a good job horrible. So it's that layer of the organization that I think is critical and is in danger right now because of what's been piled on top of them for the last couple of years, in addition to that job just being difficult when you think about how you spend your day. I mean, I spent my day as a frontline manager largely putting out fires. And the time, because there was the customer who's demanding my presence and the delivery that's happening here, and it's Star Wars weekend and all of these different things are happening. And the time that I committed to my team in terms of recognition, in terms of coaching, in terms of training, almost always came out of that extra bucket of time. So it was after I broke 50 hours that week is when I started to be able to really focus meaningfully on developing my team. I did my best to be one of those managers who's shoulder to shoulder with you every day and is living inside of the operation, not in the office. But sometimes the administrative burden gets to a point where it's hard to balance that. And ultimately, managers go where they're held accountable and often where they're compensated. And if you look at how you're measuring your managers, if the experience of the employee and things like retention and engagement and development aren't in there, where do you think people are going to spend their time? And I, having been a manager at multiple businesses, can say I was never measured, compensated, or bonused based on anything related to my employee experience. It was always based on business metrics. And that's where a lot of people are going to go. And then you have some managers who are going to add on and add that extra time, but we can't expect everyone to do that. So if we want to improve the frontline experience, we have to improve the manager experience.
And you mentioned a minute ago that frontline managers are burnt out. They're doing crazy hours. They're responsible on two sides for everybody. And what I'm thinking about is this is L&D's kind of realm, of course, but you mentioned that it's a maths problem. Speak to that a little bit. What are you seeing people trying, and what isn't working and what is working?
Sure. I think the issue with this is it's bigger than L&D and it's way bigger than training. Because for me, we have to tear down the position and really take a hard look at what is expected of frontline managers. What's the role need to be? Where is their time and attention meant to be focused given their limited capacity? And then start reassessing, well, how do we identify candidates for these positions? A lot of places, when I work with different organizations, I love visiting locations and then talking to the store manager, the location manager, and asking, how'd you get this job? And more often than not, they were the best performer in the operation. The manager left, next person up type of situation. Does that mean that they have great potential or have been enabled to manage a business and lead a team? Usually not. And kind of vice versa. Some of the best team leaders I've ever seen were pretty bad employees. Not bad on the HR level, but just not the people you would stare at and say, that is a top performer, because their skill set was in a different place. They were great with the people side of things, maybe not so great with the day-to-day nuts and bolts of doing the job, but they can lead the team doing the job. They're just not the best at the job, which is perfectly fine for what we need this person to be able to do. So for me, I think L&D and HR and operations need to work together to say, what does this position need to be? What do we expect these people to do? How do we find the right people? How do we enable them effectively? How do we measure them effectively? How do we compensate them correctly in order to get the type of outcome we want? And if you can train people all day, and I think it is beneficial when we kind of throw the leadership development thing out the door for a little while and start rethinking what does it actually mean to continuously develop and continuously support and continuously enable people doing this type of work. But you can do that all day. But if they're overburdened with tasks, if the administrative side of their job overwhelms the ability to focus on their team members, L&D can't fix this by ourselves. So we need to work across the different stakeholders who rely on this level of management to make it work. And I see more and more organizations are recognizing that we need to go from a world where leadership development, big air quotes, is a program and it has a start and a stop, and it's something that happens when you get promoted, and leaning more into the reality of continuous enablement, continuous collaboration, connecting managers who have overcome challenges with managers who may be facing those challenges now. So making it more of a collective and collaborative experience of development and less of a, well, you're promoted to position, but the next program's not scheduled for 9 months, so figure it out until you get there type of stuff.
Well, this ties in really nicely with, I think, your book. And one of the things, it's called The Modern Learning Ecosystem. One of the things I really like about it is this emphasis on helping organizations navigate this non-stop workplace change. And it does feel like there's a kind of relentlessness to different roles, to everything now. We're completely swamped and bombarded. Things are going at light speed. And I think that it feels like an important contribution for you to have a book that kind of acknowledges that that is the status quo. And, it says on your kind of write-up that the book is going to provide a step-by-step set of instructions for architecting and a disruption-ready learning ecosystem that will help employees solve today's biggest problems whilst building the knowledge and skills needed to seize tomorrow's opportunities. So let's break this down. What is a learning ecosystem, first of all? And then I want to talk to you a bit about the skills there and also then these kind of techniques for being disruption-ready. So what do you mean by this learning ecosystem?
It speaks to the idea of breaking outside the traditional four walls of the learning and development function. So taking into consideration all of the tools, tactics, and technologies that we can use to help people do their jobs more effectively. So instead of staying kind of sat in our own box and saying, well, for me to help, I have to be able to use my learning management system and a set of job aids and a classroom session. And that's all I've got. Looking more broadly to say, how do people do their jobs? What tools do they use to do it? How can I get closer to that experience of work in order to help people execute their jobs more effectively? So it's kind of a combination of expanding our strategies as well as expanding the mindset of how we think about what it means to enable and support people in the workplace.
So give me a few more tangible examples then that could be included in a learning ecosystem that you would consider beyond like a blended learning campaign that we used to talk about 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yep. We're still talking about those things.
Yeah.
So
we've been in this industry a while, right? So
yeah. Everything old is new again. That's how you know when you're at a certain point, when you see the articles start getting written, and you're like, oh man, we wrote this 8 years ago. Mm-hmm. The cycle is beginning again.
Yeah.
But if you look at the framework that I present in the book, the Modern Learning Ecosystem Framework, the foundational layer where I believe everything begins when it comes to our ability to help people do their jobs is the layer called shared knowledge. So it means access to timely, reliable, relevant information. If you think about most organizations, that's usually not the direct purview of learning and development. We may play a role, we may contribute certain types of content. We build lots of job aids and things like that. But you may have a knowledge management function, or it may be the operations team that maintains the company SharePoint and those types of things. So from the beginning of the framework, it speaks to the need for us to get outside the learning and development silo and work across functions that are curating these types of resources that people need to do their job, so that we don't have this disconnect where, okay, the SOP is written by that team, it's maintained and uploaded to a resource owned by that team, and then we're building training related to it, and none of those things line up in terms of, then you got the employee sitting in the middle saying, where do I go and why does none of this seem like it was made by the same person? So that's kind of a common example where there's a disconnect often outside of what L&D owns, and it's the foundational layer of what I talk about that needs to improve in the book.
So let me ask you this. Do you think, I've only really worked in kind of small-ish organizations. Obviously, I've worked for big organizations, but it seems to me as though tacit knowledge just kind of lives in the minds of a few people who've kind of been there from the beginning. I don't even really know how do you approach getting that knowledge out of those people and sharing it around? I mean, can you really leapfrog the experience of someone who's been doing something for 10 years and someone who's new comes in and needs to be able to do it to the same standard? Does it depend on the job? How do you do that knowledge sharing practically when it seems to me like experts kind of own that and have that experience sort of locked away in their minds and they just do the thing brilliantly?
Yep. It lives in the minds and PowerPoints of your top performers. So I'm on record. Anyone wants to argue with me, PowerPoint or slides in general are not referenceable materials. But this is the same challenge I saw when I left Disney. I went into contact center operations in the higher education space. And I very quickly started to realize that a lot of the training requests we were getting were based on the fact that people just couldn't find rudimentary information. So we were turning a lot of things into click next to continue, Captivate modules that weren't the types of things that I would expect someone to have to remember, given the expansive amount of information that a contact center agent needs to know, especially when they support multiple products. So I went digging and started to figure out we had the traditional knowledge management problem, which was that's in a shared drive over there. That's in a SharePoint. They're building their SharePoint website. So it looks like a fancy website. And no one can actually use it. Like all of those things were happening. And so I set about solving a problem that no one had raised their hand to say we have a problem, but it was actually fundamental to a lot of the issues that we were seeing, especially in learning and development. And along the way, I ran into the same issue you spoke to, is that we had certain senior employees or experienced employees or highly capable employees that knew how to solve problems, that had their own resources, that had built these really ugly PowerPoint presentations that people then tacked up on their cubicle walls because they were more useful than anything learning and development was creating. So it came down to not necessarily finding the way, but it started with finding ways to foster opportunities to help people share. Because a lot of times, and what I started to realize was, people, if you give them the chance and you elevate kind of the priority of sharing what people know, and you make sure that your organization doesn't somehow contradict that by kind of connecting influence and knowledge, because sometimes the knowledge is power thing starts to happen and people hoard know-how because it's currency. So there's cultural considerations that you have to take into account. Luckily, I didn't really run into a lot of that. It was more about finding ways to give people a chance to put information out there. So a couple quick examples is one, I went hunting knowledge champions in my organization. And the thing I didn't allow to happen was I didn't let management tell me who to go to. Because usually managers, when you ask for champions inside the operation, they give you their favorite employees.
Right.
Not the ones that actually know anything. And in some cases, the people that I needed were, let's just say, problematic because they were pushing, right? They pushed back on things. They became issues, not for the HR reasons, but for they were just kind of a pain in certain ways. But they were incredibly useful because they had seen so many things and had overcome so many challenges. And they had a passion behind helping. Sometimes that just run afoul of different things. So I could find a way to leverage that differently.
And so specifically, what would you do with those people? How would you gather their knowledge and share that? Or would you get them to share with others? Like, how do you do that at scale?
Some people we upskilled and gave them contributor permissions inside of the knowledge management platform we were using. So we just let them loose so that they could contribute in areas where we defined that they had expertise. They couldn't kind of send us sideways in other areas, but we kind of bottled that capability and pointed it in a certain direction.
In response to questions that people were asking for, like, I need to know this, can someone help me? And that was the way, or it was like push content onto whoever may want it.
So in some cases it was writing, as an example, writing articles. So if we're talking about, you're facing certain challenges to people who call on the phone, how would you solve for that? Here, you can write content over here. My team will proof it and then we'll push it so that we don't have to go through the process of putting L&D in the middle of things. You already know this information, you can go. From a social exchange perspective, we started our journey with kind of a formal community management setup. So my team were the ones who were coming in answering questions that people were asking. And then we started to tag those people. So instead of us answering, we were pulling their peer group in to engage in the conversation. And then over time, they just started to take over. So my team faded away and we just made sure that people got the answers that they wanted. And we just kind of made sure the conversation stayed on track. But we didn't have to do all the effort, do all the research and dig to find answers because the people who knew were starting to connect the dots. And we realized that our job as L&D was less to create the solution. It was more to connect those who know with those who need. And that's what we were doing. And then one other example is we had kind of these more nuanced challenges that people face that it didn't get solved through this kind of more curation, collaboration type effort. So as a simple example, we went out and we sourced what are the biggest kind of challenges that people are facing that's not being covered in training, not being covered in other materials. And then we found people who had street cred with those particular topics. We brought them in the office. We sat them in front of a webcam. And then we asked them very targeted questions about how they would solve this problem. How do they deal with this issue? And what we found was a lot of those issues, there wasn't one answer. There were 12. So there was, I do it this way. I do it this way. I do it this way. And they were all perfectly viable answers. But there wasn't an SOP guiding this kind of stuff. So we took all of those answers, curated them into playlists a la YouTube, and published them in our knowledge sharing resource where people could go and find the one that made sense to them. So instead of training trying to say, everyone do it this way, when it's not that kind of topic, we could say, here are 12 of your peers explaining how they deal with these situations, mix and match, as you will. So it was finding different ways to enable that knowledge sharing kind of culture that we were looking to build. And that's the recommendation I would have for everybody is there's no one model. Even two businesses who do the exact same types of work, you have different cultures, you have different technologies, you have just different vibes about how people leverage and share and curate knowledge. So it's about finding the mechanisms that work for you. But in my opinion, in my experience, if you don't solve for this, it makes the rest of the learning ecosystem falter because so much it kind of rests on top of people's ability to quickly access reliable information. Because frankly, that's how we live life, is through that information to solve the problems we can self-serve and then rely on more structured solutions when we absolutely need to. And that's also how you scale, keep pace with change. It starts there because again, L&D, only so much time and so many resources and so many problems that we can address. But if we activate this type of culture and build these types of champions and give them a chance, that's how we solve for those types of issues.
So that's your first layer. What comes next?
Layer up is performance support. And then everyone asks me, what's the difference between knowledge sharing and performance support? And the answer is that line's blurring, especially in the advent of different types of AI-enabled tools. But the idea is that one's passive and one's active. Performance support is raising your hand and saying, help, right? I can't figure this out. No amount of self-serving information is going to do this for me. Help me. So this, again, is going to look different, just like every other layer in the framework in different organizations. In some cases, maybe this is an electronic performance support tool. It's going to walk you through the process if that's something that can be handled. In some cases, it's a Slack channel where you can go and say, help, who has faced this problem before, and the right person can show up and make sure you get an answer. And now, with the advent of some Gen AI capabilities, it's more and more becoming the chatbot side of the world or the digital assistant side of the world. So as a kind of funny example, I took a lot of my content from the last 10 years and used it to construct a custom GPT on ChatGPT. And there's now a GPT for anyone who's on the paid layer of ChatGPT called LearnGeek AI, where you can just go in and ask for advice on learning strategies, and it mines my content to provide a response in a way that kind of sounds like you're talking to me, to give you some guidance based on these types of principles and frameworks we're talking about today. So the performance support layers, the easiest way for me to explain it is it's making sure that someone can raise their hand and say help and get the help they need in a timely, reliable way so they can perform at their best.
And I wouldn't be doing that at the knowledge share levels, would I? Or would I? I mean, I'm thinking, what would be the trigger for someone to kind of access knowledge sharing versus performance support?
Sure. So I'm let's go back to a contact center. I'm on the phone with a customer. They ask me, what is the interest rate on this particular loan? I go into my knowledge sharing resource. I say it's 7.8%. I'm making up numbers.
Okay, sure.
I don't know if that's good or bad.
Yeah, so, don't nobody take this as a guidance.
Yeah, 7.8%. And then the performance support layer would be, I don't know how to answer this question at all. I can't find this information. Help. Mm-hmm. So that's the way I define the difference. It is blurry. And like I said, today with, let's say that you're using a digital assistant within your organization, both of those could happen in the exact same way. So you don't have to necessarily go into a separate knowledge resource to get a question answered when you have a problem. Now you can go to your digital assistant, just ask the question, and it just points it at you. Or maybe it's a little bit more of a proactive system where if the digital assistant is listening to the conversation, it can just present that information so that you don't really need to trigger that support. It's just happening for you. So these lines are blurring. I think a lot of these lines in my framework are starting to blur through the implementation of different types of tools.
And what about the next layer? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Reinforcement. So this is the one that I believe is missing in the vast majority of organizations.
I think so too. This is like a giant bugbear of mine, is that actually we know from learning science, we know from everything we know about knowledge and learning, and we need to reinforce things. And I loved that when you said earlier that the thing that you remember about your first induction was that you did drills. To me, in a way, this reinforcement, this drills thing is so helpful. That's got to be how we maintain our knowledge and grow it, surely, and kind of build our own self-confidence with these things, right? Not just responding to whatever a chatbot can give us in the moment, which is useful, but ultimately we need to be able to do these things for ourselves in certain cases. So yeah, it's the layer that really emphasizes the math problem that is supporting people at scale. Because again,
I think most learning development teams know everything you just said. They know the foundational learning science principles. They know about spaced repetition and retrieval practice and these types of ideas. The how is the problem. Because in a lot of organizations, L&D still has a pretty limited access to the audience. So the operation says, yes, we'll do the training. It's 2 hours long. You have 2 hours of access to the employees. And after that, they're gone. And then in a lot of ways, we just can't see them anymore, right? They don't use maybe the learning management system as part of their day-to-day. So we're not there. And that's why I think a lot of teams are excited about tools like Microsoft Teams, because it gives us a channel to reach the audience where they're doing the work, instead of us having to kind of wave and say, come over here, when people are already too busy to do something extra that's not part of their day-to-day responsibilities. So it's that reinforcement layer of looking at the people you're supporting, the types of things that you need people to retain, that so they can do their job safely and effectively, that maybe they can't rely on the foundational layers. They can't look it up when they need it. They can't ask for help when they need it. They just need to know, right? So Disney safety is a great example, right? I used in a recent presentation that I did, I talked about the crud. What's it called? I should know this because I've talked about it because I did it so often. Reinforcement. So the unusual condition quiz.
Oh, okay.
So
that does sound like something that would slip from your mind.
There it is. So at Disney, hundreds, if not thousands of times as a manager, I would walk up to my cast members at different locations in the operation.
In their different outfits.
Yep. They're all wearing different costumes. And I would say something to the effect of, if you heard an unusual noise, what would you do? And there is one answer to that question. But we ask that question over and over again. I don't care how long you've worked here.
Right.
Because it's one of the most important things you can do working in an attractions operation, is knowing that if you hear an unusual noise, the first thing you do is you stop the ride.
Okay.
And then you figure out what the noise is. And it could be nothing, or it could be something. And what we know is, if it is something, how problematic that can be for everyone involved in the situation. So we would do these drills. I would just walk up to people casually. And sometimes we would mark down how many people we asked per day and how many questions how many people answered it correctly. We would coach people who maybe didn't get it quickly enough or didn't know what the answer was. But it was kind of the lo-fi example of reinforcement. It was a simple question, but it was the question that I can tell you came in handy, because later on in different environments, I would see people take action or ask the right question or push back, because we had prepared them to deal with this issue. And that's why safety is at the top of the list in terms of the priorities of the organization. So it's about looking at your operation, saying, what are those things that people need to know? Recognizing that the answer is not everything, right? We can't reinforce everything. People over time will collect a lot of that insight and knowledge where they know more than you might expect them to. But especially at a baseline level for your entire workforce or people doing similar types of work, what's the thing they need to know? What are the things they must retain top of mind so they can make the right decision, provide the right experience, answer the right guest question? And that's where we figure out, well, how do we reinforce? It could be through digital means. It could be through the kind of low-tech example of me walking around with a notepad and asking the question and making sure I get the right answer. It could be through practice. We do a lot of work in huddles with frontline organizations where managers might have a set of questions and run through practice exercises before the shift begins. So there's a lot of different ways to introduce reinforcement, but it's that continuous touch point and that continuous ability to keep applying what you know. Because again, L&D knows the science behind this. Mm-hmm. We just have to get creative tactically about how do we embed this opportunity in the day-to-day reality of the workforce when they're already overburdened, they don't have time, and the operation often push back and say that we don't have time for learning thing.
Yeah.
We have to find ways around that. And I, through experience, know we can. We just have to get creative.
What's great examples. I think that they're really rich. And one of the things I was thinking about as you were sort of talking about what it is that we choose to reinforce is it sort of led me to thinking about skills. And you've got a kind of particular view on skills, I think, which some may find a little bit controversial, but I'm not sure that that's true. But I think I've heard you say that skills are often poorly defined and poorly measured. And if you agree with that, and it's true, what do we need to be doing better?
I thought you were going to say I have a particular set of skills, and then it was going to be
it sounds to me like you already do have a good set of skills, which you're sharing right here now, knowledge sharing on this podcast.
Set of skills.
Do you think that's true? Are skills kind of poorly poorly defined, poorly measured? Are we doing things in an old-fashioned way that we need to shift? It seems like skills is such a huge topic, doesn't it? Everybody's always talking about skills. And to your point about, the speed of change, we need new skills to survive. We're going to need to kind of get our workforce upskilled. But how are we doing on that? And what are your thoughts?
So on paper, it's all great. But so was the competency mapping thing that HR has been trying to do for the past 30 years. And I struggle with understanding the difference if we haven't taken the time to rigorously define what skills mean within roles within the organization and how they attach to what we're trying to achieve as a business. And I see a lot of the conversation around skills, taxonomies, ontologies, technology, these pieces kind of really leaning into either really vague definitions of different types of skills or a lot of inference in terms of, well, if you have this resume and you do this type of job, you must be a level 2 of this. And it's like, are you? Are you though? And when you start to think about things like, let's take presentation skills as an example. Well, we know certain jobs might need to have great presentation skills, but how do we define great presentation skills? And then how do you tweak that to the individual's style and their ability to reach a similar outcome, but in meaningfully different ways? Because I would never recommend anyone try to do my version of presentation skill, because I do things a little differently, and I came out of Disney. So I kind of have a bit of a Disney bent to the way that I tell stories, but other people will be just as effective, but do it differently. So I don't think
it's lacking nuance, the way we're defining skills, and also kind
rigor. The rigor's missing.
Okay, rigor.
And what I think is interesting, though, is if you, again, kind of step away from people like me and you zoom into the frontline workforce again, what's really interesting is that everything I just said that I think is a challenge when it comes to adopting a skills-based approach to talent strategy, it works in the frontline workforce because their skills are very clearly defined and very measurable. So instead of me and my presentation skills, if you take a cashier at a retail store, we know exactly what they need to do, exactly what skills are required to do it, and exactly how we measure if they're good at it or if they're not good at it. Right? All of that has been clarified to the point where if you go to certain retail stores, you can actually see on the point of sale system screen, cashiers getting scores at the end of their transactions. There are certain very large retailers where if you as a customer pay attention to what's on their screen, you might see them get a green or a red, or a letter grade or a number grade, because they're measuring things like scans per minute. And if they executed the transaction in the way that it's meant to be in the timing that it's meant to be executed. So it's all the rigor's actually there. And there's a scale question, right? Because instead of in the corporate workforce, we might have 500 employees doing 400 different jobs. Where in the frontline workforce, you might have 30,000 people doing 6 different jobs. So the scale is also there to be able to do this in a meaningful way. So where I'm going is, I think it's one of the places of the many places that I think as L&D and as HR, we can learn a lot from how the frontline operates and what it takes to enable frontline teams, and then take what we learn there and then apply that in other parts of the organization to say, well, can we apply this much rigor, this much measurement, this much data to our skills-based strategies elsewhere? Because on the frontline team, it becomes especially impactful because you know who might need coaching, who might need additional training, who is great at their job and might be the person that we want to, based on their skills and their measurable skills, move into another part of the operation or elevate into a different position. So I think when we talk about kind of running a business through the skills of your people, I would suggest that that's how a lot of frontline operations already run. They just haven't said we're a skills-based organization. They just know that they are, because that's the nature of doing that kind of work. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from that side of the organization. So like I said, on paper, completely makes sense. I very much like the idea of focusing on people's capability as opposed to other loose, fluffy metrics or lack of data and these types of things, but adding the rigor to it that makes it less inference and more real and more reflective of people's actually ability. That's where I see the gap. And I think a lot of organizations that I've worked with that have been on this journey for a while are starting to kind of run into that question mark to say, okay, we've got the tech infrastructure, we've got ontologies and taxonomies mapped to positions and whatnot, but the data and the measurement and these types of things are where the gaps are. So I'm very interested to hear how organizations are potentially applying this or learning about this from their frontline teams, because I think a lot of the math problems that exist in the corporate side of skill strategy are actually solved in the frontline side. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, look, we have to talk about AI and its disruptive influence, because we're talking about change, we're talking about all sorts of things, and I just want to land on this as our final kind of topic a little bit, if you don't mind. So let's say I'm in an L&D role and AI is surrounding me. What should I be thinking and doing about it?
The frank reality is there's no job this doesn't touch. And I'm doing a variety of different sessions on this topic, because if you don't talk about AI at least once an hour, it knows. So there's a common refrain out there nowadays that says something to the effect of, AI won't take your job, someone using AI will. And I think that is wrong. And the reason that's wrong is that that statement supposes that your job still exists, at least in the way that it exists today. And it's about doing what we do today differently through technology. That's not this story. And it also wasn't the story when the internet came to be and became part of our day-to-day lives and workplace. And it wasn't the situation when mobile devices changed how we work and live. So we're on the next shift when it comes to kind of digital paradigm shifts in everyday life as well as the workplace. And what is important is not so much we look at, because there are definitely short-term gains to be made in terms of applying new tools to do what we do today in different ways. I do that right now. Simple example, I use a lot of AI-generated voices in the different types of content. And I also have a clone that I can use if I want to deploy the less emotional version of me into different settings.
That would be a shame.
Yeah, it's nowhere near as fun.
I don't want to hear that one.
And I also mentioned my chatbot, which I think is just a fun use of my content for different things as kind of an example. But L&D has to look several steps higher. So it's not just about how the individual changes and evolves to this. It's not just how the L&D function. It's how the organization on whole evolves. And let's go back to the contact center world again as an example. So there are different examples already out there of contact center organizations trying to replace large swaths of their workforce with bots, specifically for that tier 1 level of support. So if a machine, whether it's on the phone or via chat, can take care of the basic question, I don't understand my bill, can you explain it to me? What does this charge mean? How do I get a support person to come out and fix my cable? Right? Those basic things that a human would typically take care of, if a machine can take care of that, frankly, I don't need as many people doing that job. So there's a direct impact to the size of the workforce in that organization. But then there's a second layer to that to say,
we seem to be so far still from that. I mean, maybe it hasn't been rolled out, but my first question to any bot is, put me onto an agent, please. Like, I don't want to talk to you. You can't even for simple things, it can't be figured out. But this is just a matter of time, right?
Much better, much faster.
Yeah.
So one of the best statements about AI is it's the worst it's ever going to be right now.
Yeah, I know.
And there's way too much money put into this. And where it's going is the reason this is on so many board of director agendas is that it's not just about, well, we can reduce the size of our workforce, which organizations typically like to do. It's also that this is going to unlock new ways of doing business. This is going to unlock new business models. And that's why you're seeing so much emphasis and so much investment and so much prioritization put into this brand of technology, similar to the ways that the internet unlocked new business models, mobile unlocked new business models, social unlocked new business models. This is the next one. And what I would say to L&D is you take that contact center example. Okay. So if a bot is taking out level tier 1 response, that means we have less contact center agents, but we still have contact center agents because the machine can't do the nuanced stuff that tier 2, tier 3. When someone screams at the bot, get me a person, right?
Capital letters typing.
So if you might have less people in play, but the people you do have require a more advanced skill set, a more advanced knowledge, a more advanced ability to deal with a customer who's not super happy right now. Not that anyone who's ever called a contact center is happy, but it changes the skill requirements and therefore the support requirements of the people who are doing the job and doing it different ways. So that's why, for me, that's where the story really needs to begin and where L&D needs to plug in, is at an organizational level. How is this changing the work that we expect people to do so that we can start to back into, well, what type of support and enablement is going to be required to bring that version of work to life? That's how this is going to impact us. And if we don't think about that, we don't have these conversations, we don't plug in with our operational partners, AI is going to become something that we don't participate in. It's going to be something that happens to us as learning and development functioning, because those decisions are going to be made, right? Fast food restaurant organizations, that's the worst way to say restaurant, but drive-thrus. I would not be surprised if within 3 years, every order you make at the drive-thru is taken by a machine, because the machine can understand a wide variety of languages. It can understand noisy environments, and it will upsell you a large soda every single time, where the person may not do that, right? The people are taking on a different responsibility, and it may be a smaller workforce in that restaurant doing different types of work. And then the question becomes, well, what support and enablement is required? So we have to plug into our organizations to ask those questions of, how is this changing the business model, the nature of work? And then how do we need to respond to that and build the right skills, the right capabilities, the right tools and processes so that we can enable that version of work? And I have a website, if anyone's curious. So I curate a magazine of AI related stories in the workplace. My chatbot's there. My presentation materials are there. If you go to learngeek.ai, that's where I'm curating related resources to that kind of this story in terms of how AI is going to impact the workplace, and then as a result, impact learning and development.
Well, that sounds like a fantastic resource. How urgent do you think this is? How urgently do we need to be doing this? What time frame do you see this changing for L&D?
So there's a slide in one of the decks that's sitting on that website where I say, today, this year, within 5 years is kind of the span that I'm giving. And as an example, like today, a machine can write better assessment questions than a person can. Translation is handled at kind of a medium scale right now. So course generation, first draft is possible, right? This year, or within the next year, translation is going to get really good through large language models. Within the next 5 years, digital content creation is going to be a completely different conversation 5 years from now. So there's kind of a bit of an informed guess with regards to how we're going. But the conversation is now. Just because I can speak as a person who works in technology, as well as a person working in the learning and development space with large, complex organizations, we're all heading in this direction. So I always say, AI is not something you're going to decide to do as L&D. It's just going to become part of your toolkit, like everything else does. So no, it doesn't matter what platforms you're using, what authoring tools you're using. They either already have or they're hard at work trying to figure out not just how can we throw an open AI integration into this and say, you can write poems with it. No, that's not what this is. Early days, there's a lot of those types of things, but we're looking for those meaningful enhancements that we can make through technology that'll help you do your job differently and more productively, more effectively, cheaper, all of these kind of different factors. And the last thing I'll say for AI is to make a comparison. If you go back to when the iPhone launched, especially when the App Store launched, which is circa 2008, and you look at what were the most popular apps in the App Store at that time, it's hilarious because you'll see Facebook and their original app, which was not good, sitting next to Google Earth, sitting next to an app called iBeer. And iBeer was an app that on your phone would make it look like it was a beer. And then when you tilted it was like you were drinking the beer.
Yeah.
That's where we are right now. Is you got some useful stuff, and then you got a bunch of iBeer
nonsense
just flying around.
But
every app that says I will make you an AI headshot is an example of that, right? I have so many AI headshots.
Yeah.
I'm in turtlenecks and way too smooth in all of them. But quickly you start to find, well, Facebook radically improved their technology and it became part of people's day-to-day life. Google Earth embedded into everything that we use, right? We don't need a virtual version of a lighter on our phones anymore, but the flashlight app became just part of every phone capability. So it's that same evolution of we're starting to find where are those meaningful use cases for the tech as the tech just starts to become embedded in what we do every day. And that's where this story is heading as well, quickly.
Fantastic. Well, that is a really, really helpful resource, LearnGeek AI. I will just mention again, in case anybody wants to check it out. Thank you so much, JD. We are out of time, but it's been such a pleasure talking to you. And I really value all of the things that you've shared because you've got some really broad and deep knowledge in this whole area of performance support and frontline workers and AI. And it's just really fascinating to talk to you. So thank you so much. And I hope to speak to you again soon. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Subscribe to stay up to date with leading lights from L&D and leave us a review to let us know what you think.